marriage bargained in winter. Chapter 1. The Desperate Bargain. The winter of 1814 was the cruelest Miss Sarah Elwood had ever known. It was not merely the frost that laced the window panes of Elwood Manor, or the way the wind howled through the cracked eaves like a starving beast. The true cold had settled in her father's study, where the ledgers lay open to pages smeared with ink-blotched figures that refused to balance. Sarah stood before the fire, though it gave little heat. The logs were the last of the seasoned oak, and she had secretly rationed them for weeks. Her younger sisters, Margaret and Lucy, were upstairs, sharing a single thin blanket and whispering stories to keep their minds from the grumbling of their empty stomachs. Their brother, Thomas, had not written from the peninsula in 6 months. Every day, Sarah watched her mother press a trembling finger to the shipping gazette, searching for casualty lists, but it was her father, Mr. Gerald Elwood, who bore the heaviest chain. Once a gentleman of modest but respectable means, he had been ruined by a series of ill-advised investments in a mining venture that had collapsed like a cavern roof. Now the debts mounted higher than the snowdrifts outside. The dunning letters arrived more frequently than the post, and the bailiffs had begun to circle like wolves. "There is no other way, Sarah," her father said, not looking up from the desk. His voice was a dry husk of its former self. "Lord Nathaniel Price has made his offer. It is generous. More than generous. It will clear every debt, secure a settlement for your mother, and provide for your sisters until they can marry." Sarah's hands, clasped behind her back, were white-knuckled. She had heard of Lord Nathaniel Price. Who in the county had not? He was a man of 40, 10 years her senior, with a reputation for ruthless pragmatism. He had inherited a crumbling estate in Northumberland, Oakwood Hall, and had rebuilt it through a series of cold, calculated decisions. He was not cruel, the gossips said, but he was not warm either. He was a man who treated marriage as he treated a balance sheet, an arrangement of assets and liabilities. "He requires a wife to produce an heir," Sarah said flatly. "That is what his letter said, in so many words." Her father winced. He is honest, at least. He did not dress it in poetry. "Poetry would have been an insult," Sarah replied. "At least honesty is a foundation. But father, I have never met the man. He might be a tyrant. He might be mad." "He is neither. I have made inquiries." Mr. Elwood finally raised his eyes. They were bloodshot, ringed with the purple of sleepless nights. "He is a man of order. He will not mistreat you. But he will not love you either. He made that explicit. He seeks a marriage of convenience. A bargain struck in winter, he called it." Sarah turned to face the window. Outside, the gardens she had once tended with such care lay buried under a seamless white shroud. The fountain where she had read poetry as a girl was now a ghostly mound. Everything beautiful was being erased. She thought of Margaret, only 15, who had already begun to lose the light in her eyes. She thought of Lucy, 12, who had asked last week if they could sell her kitten for food. Sarah had wept then, privately, into her pillow so no one would hear. "What are the terms?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fracture in her chest. Her father slid a folded letter across the desk. Sarah unfolded it and read. Lord Nathaniel's handwriting was sharp, economical, without flourish. He proposed a marriage by special license within the fortnight. He would settle all Elwood debts immediately upon the signing of the contract. He would provide an annuity of £300 per annum to Mrs. Elwood for life. He would set aside a dowry of £1,000 for each of Sarah's sisters, to be paid upon their marriages. In return, Sarah would reside at Oakwood Hall, manage his household, and provide him with an heir. There was no mention of affection, companionship, or even mutual respect. It was a transaction. And yet, as Sarah read the letter a second time, she noticed something odd. At the very bottom, beneath his signature, he had added a postscript in a slightly smaller hand. I shall not force my company upon you beyond what is necessary. You will have your own chambers, your own sitting room, and full authority over the household accounts. I am not a man of cruelty, Miss Elwood, only of necessity. It was not kindness, precisely, but it was something, a recognition that she was a person, not merely a vessel for an heir. I will do it, Sarah said. Her father's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it looked like collapse. Thank you, he whispered. God forgive me. Thank you. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Vows. The wedding took place on a December morning so grey that the sky and the earth seemed to have merged into one endless sheet of pewter. The village church was nearly empty. Sarah's mother wept silently into a handkerchief. Margaret and Lucy stood huddled together, their best dresses let out and taken in so many times the fabric had grown thin at the seams. Lord Nathaniel had sent a carriage for them, a sleek black equipage with his crest on the door, and it had arrived with a basket of provisions, bread, cheese, a roasted chicken, and a bottle of wine. The Elwoods had eaten like royalty the night before, and Sarah had felt the shame of gratitude like a stone in her stomach. She had not seen her groom until he appeared at the altar. Lord Nathaniel Price was not what she had expected. The gossips had painted him as a cold, angular man, all sharp edges and flat effect. And indeed, he was tall and lean, with a face that might have been handsome if it had ever learned to smile. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were a pale grey that reminded her of the winter sky. He wore a dark blue coat with no ornamentation, no jewelled pins or fob watch. He looked like a man who valued function over fashion. When she reached him, he offered a short, formal bow. Miss Elwood, he said. His voice was low and even, without warmth, but also without disdain. Lord Price, she replied. The vicar began the service. Sarah spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Lord Nathaniel spoke his with the same measured calm he might have used to sign a contract. When he placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, no gem, his fingers brushed hers. His skin was cold. The kiss that followed was brief and chaste, a mere brushing of lips. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in that brief contact, Sarah felt something unexpected, a tremor in his hand, so slight she might have imagined it. She looked up at his face, but his expression had not changed. After the ceremony, there was no wedding breakfast. Lord Nathaniel explained that the roads were worsening and they needed to depart for Oakwood Hall before the next snow. He offered Sarah's family a brief, polite farewell, then handed her into the carriage. The journey took 6 hours. For the first hour, they sat in silence, the carriage swaying over frozen ruts, the windows opaque with frost. Sarah watched the landscape blur past, fields and hedgerows and bare-limbed oaks, all rendered in shades of white and grey. She had never been north of Yorkshire. She had never been anywhere, really. Elwood Manor had been her entire world. You are frightened, Lord Nathaniel said. It was not a question. Sarah turned to look at him. He was sitting across from her, his back straight, his gloved hands resting on his knees. I am, she admitted. There seemed no point in pretense. That is sensible, he replied. Fright is the mind's way of preparing for the unknown. I would be more concerned if you were not. She blinked at him. Is that meant to be comforting? No, he said. It is meant to be honest. I told you I would not lie to you. I intend to keep that promise. Sarah considered this. She had been raised on polite fictions, the careful evasions of drawing-room conversation, the cheerful lies that smoothed over discomfort. Lord Nathaniel's bluntness was jarring, but not unpleasant. At least she knew where she stood. May I ask you something? She said. You may. Why me? There must be dozens of women in London who would have jumped at the chance to be your wife. Women with fortunes of their own, or titles, or beauty that does not require a 6-hour carriage ride to appreciate. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was a departure from his usual stillness. You underestimate yourself, Miss Elwood. But to answer your question, I chose you because you are desperate. Desperate people are predictable. They honor their bargains because they have no other choice. A woman of fortune might indulge in caprice. A woman of title might feel entitled to demand affection. You will not. Sarah felt the words like a slap. She had known this was a transaction, but to hear it stated so baldly, with such clinical detachment, made her feel like a horse bought at auction. I see, she said quietly. He must have noticed something in her expression, because he added, That was crueler than I intended. I apologize. What I meant to say is that I admire your courage. You are sacrificing yourself for your family. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. She looked at him. In the dim light of the carriage, his grey eyes seemed almost soft. Thank you, she said. That was kinder than you intended, I think. He inclined his head. And then, for the rest of the journey, they spoke of trivial things. The weather, the roads, the quality of the horses. It was not intimacy, but it was not hostility either. It was, Sarah thought, the beginning of something. She did not yet know what. Chapter 3. The Isolation of Strangers. Oakwood Hall emerged from the snow like a dark ship from a white fog. It was a formidable house of grey stone, with narrow windows and a steep roof that shed snow in great groaning avalanches. There were no formal gardens, no ornamental trees, only a stark, windswept expanse of frozen ground, and a line of skeletal elms that rattled in the wind. It was beautiful in a severe, unforgiving way, like a face that had forgotten how to smile. The interior was warmer than Sarah had expected. Lord Nathaniel, it seemed, did not believe in suffering for aesthetics. The fires were generous, the candles plentiful, and the servants, a small, efficient staff, moved with quiet competence. A housekeeper named Mrs. Holloway greeted Sarah with a curtsy and a murmured, "Welcome, my lady," as if she had been expecting her for years. Sarah was shown to her chambers, a suite of rooms on the second floor, overlooking the eastern moors. There was a bedroom with a 4-poster bed piled high with quilts, a sitting room with a writing desk and a fire already lit, and a small dressing room with a wardrobe that had been stocked with new gowns. Sarah ran her fingers over the fabric, fine wool, sensible muslin, a velvet for evenings. Lord Nathaniel had anticipated her needs. He had, she realized, prepared for her arrival with the same precision he would have applied to a military campaign. That night, they dined together in the small family dining room, a cosier space than the cavernous formal hall. Lord Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. Sarah sat to his right. The food was excellent, a mutton pie, roasted root vegetables, a pudding with currants, and the servants served in silence. Sarah tried to make conversation, but Lord Nathaniel's responses were brief, and his attention seemed elsewhere. After the meal, he excused himself to his study, saying he had correspondence to attend to. The next day was much the same, and the next, and the next. Sarah explored the house, learning its quirks and passages. She introduced herself to each servant and memorized their names. She inspected the linen closet, the still-room, the kitchen garden buried under snow. She wrote letters to her mother and sisters, though she had no idea when the post would next get through. The snow fell and fell, piling against the windows like a siege. Lord Nathaniel kept to his own schedule. He rose early, took his breakfast alone in his study, and spent the mornings reviewing estate accounts. He rode out in the afternoons, regardless of the weather, to check on his tenants and his livestock. He dined with Sarah each evening, but the conversations remained stilted. He asked after her comfort, and she assured him she wanted for nothing. She asked about his day, and he gave her a 3-sentence summary that revealed nothing of his thoughts or feelings. The silence began to wear on her. Not because she craved conversation, she had always been content with her own company, but because the silence felt like a wall. He was keeping her at a distance, and she did not understand why. On the 10th night, a blizzard struck. The wind howled like a chorus of the damned, and the snow fell so thickly that Sarah could not see her hand before her face. The house groaned and shuddered. A window in the east corridor shattered, and the servants spent an hour nailing a board over the gap. The fires were kept high, but the cold still seeped through the stones. Sarah could not sleep. She wrapped herself in a shawl and went down to the library, hoping a book might quiet her mind. The library was dark, but a faint glow came from the far end, a single candle burning on a desk. Lord Nathaniel sat there, slumped in his chair, a glass of brandy at his elbow. He was not reading. He was staring at the fire, with an expression Sarah had not seen before, hollow, almost haunted. She should have retreated. She knew she should have. But something in his face held her there. "My lord," she said softly. He looked up, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw exhaustion, yes, but also something deeper, a loneliness so old and so familiar that it felt like a mirror. Then he blinked, and the mask was back. "It is late," he said. "You should be in bed." "So should you." She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the rug. "But neither of us can sleep, it seems." He did not argue. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind screamed. "My first wife died in a storm like this," he said suddenly, without preamble. His voice was flat, as if he were reading a report. "She was travelling from London to join me here. The carriage overturned on an icy road. She was thrown clear, but she struck her head on a stone. She died 3 days later, without ever regaining consciousness. She was 22 years old." Sarah's breath caught. She had not known. No one had told her. The gossips had mentioned a first wife, but they had spoken only of her beauty and her fortune. They had never said how she died. "I am so sorry," Sarah whispered. Lord Nathaniel shrugged, a small, bitter movement. "I barely knew her. Ours was a marriage of convenience as well. Her father needed a title for his daughter. I needed her dowry to rebuild this house. We had been married for 6 weeks. She spent most of that time in London, buying gowns. I do not think she ever wanted to come here. I think she was running away from me when she died." Sarah's heart ached. Not for the dead woman precisely, she had never known her, but for the man sitting across from her, who had carried this guilt for years without ever speaking of it. "That was not your fault," Sarah said. "Was it not?" He took a long drink of brandy. "I married her for money. I brought her to a cold, remote house she had never seen. I did not love her. I did not even try to make her happy. And then she died, and I inherited her fortune anyway. The universe has a grim sense of justice." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Sarah thought carefully before she spoke. "You are not the same man you were then," she said. "You have rebuilt this house. You have tenants who speak of you with respect. You provided for my family when no one else would. You may have married me for practical reasons, but you have been nothing but kind to me since I arrived. That is not the behaviour of a man who learns nothing from his mistakes." Lord Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. His grey eyes were unreadable. Then slowly, something shifted in his face, a crack in the ice, a thaw. "You are not what I expected, Sarah," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. "Neither are you, Nathaniel," she replied. They sat together in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of strangers avoiding each other, but the silence of two people who have finally begun to understand. Chapter 4. The Thaw. The blizzard lasted 3 days, By the time it ended, the drifts were so deep that the roads were impassable. The nearest village was 5 miles away, and the post would not come through for another week. Sarah and Nathaniel were trapped together in Oakwood Hall, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but exist in each other's company. At first, the proximity was awkward. They had spent 10 days orbiting each other like distant planets. Now they were forced into the same orbit, the same rooms, the same hours. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the awkwardness began to dissolve. It started with breakfast. On the morning after their conversation in the library, Nathaniel appeared in the small dining room at the same time as Sarah. He poured her tea without being asked. She passed him the butter. They ate in companionable silence, and when he reached for the newspaper, he hesitated, then set it aside. "Would you like to walk the grounds with me this morning?" he asked. "The snow will be deep, but I can show you the walled garden. It is quite beautiful in winter." Sarah agreed, and they spent an hour tramping through the drifts, their breaths pluming in the cold air. The walled garden was indeed beautiful, a quiet, frozen sanctuary where the bare branches of fruit trees traced delicate patterns against the white sky. Nathaniel pointed out the places where roses would bloom in spring, where the herbs grew in summer, where the bees would swarm in July. He spoke with a quiet enthusiasm she had not heard before, and she found herself listening not just to his words, but to the warmth beneath them. In the afternoons, they read together in the library, not the same book, but side by side, their chairs drawn close to the fire. Sometimes they discussed what they were reading. Nathaniel preferred histories and agricultural treatises. Sarah loved poetry and novels. They argued amiably about the merits of Mr. Wordsworth's Daffodils versus Mr. Gibbon's Romans, and Sarah discovered that Nathaniel had a dry, unexpected sense of humour. He made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh, when he described the time his prize ram had escaped and terrorised the vicar's tea party. In the evenings they played cards or chess. Nathaniel was a ruthless strategist, but Sarah was cunning in her own way, and she beat him twice at piquet. He took his losses with good grace, though his eyes glittered with competitive fire. Once, when she won a particularly close game, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You are a surprising woman, Sarah Elwood," he said. "Sarah Price," she corrected softly. "I am your wife." He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. "So you are," he said. And he did not let go. That night, something changed. Sarah did not retreat to her chambers after dinner. Instead, she followed Nathaniel to the library, where the fire had burned down to embers. He knelt to add more wood, and she knelt beside him. Their shoulders touched. The warmth of the fire mingled with the warmth of his body, and Sarah felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Nathaniel," she said. He turned to look at her. In the firelight, his face was softer, younger. The hard lines of pragmatism had smoothed away, and she saw the man beneath, the man who had been lonely for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. "I did not expect this," she admitted. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was trading my freedom for my family's survival. I thought I would spend my life as a well-fed prisoner in a comfortable cage, but that is not what this is." "What is it, then?" His voice was low, almost tentative. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I would like to find out. Together." He raised his hand and touched her face, a feather-light brush of his knuckles against her cheek. She leaned into the touch, and he exhaled shakily, as if he had been holding his breath for years. "I am not an easy man to love," he said. "I did not ask for easy," she replied. "I asked for honest." He kissed her then, not the cold, perfunctory kiss of the wedding altar, but a real kiss, hesitant and searching and achingly tender. When they parted, his eyes were bright. "I am afraid," he whispered. "So am I," she said, "but we can be afraid together." Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow melted, and the roads opened, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing ground. Sarah wrote to her family with news of her happiness, a happiness she had not dared to hope for, and could still scarcely believe. Her mother wept with relief. Margaret and Lucy sent drawings of the kittens that had been born in the stable. Thomas had written at last. He was alive and well and would be home by summer. Nathaniel kept his promises. The Elwood debts were paid. The annuity was settled. The dowries were set aside. But he did more than that. He visited Sarah's family in the spring, bringing gifts and warm words. He invited Margaret and Lucy to stay at Oakwood Hall for the summer, and he personally taught them to ride. He commissioned a portrait of Sarah to hang in the library, not because he needed to display his wealth, but because he wanted to see her face every time he walked into the room. And in the autumn, when Sarah told him she was with child, he wept. Not silently, not stoically, but openly, with joy so fierce it shook his whole body. "I did not know I could be this happy," he said, holding her close. "I did not think it was possible." She smiled against his chest. "Neither did I." The winter that followed was not cruel. It was gentle, filled with fireside conversations and shared laughter, and the quiet miracle of two people who had started with nothing but a bargain and had built something that resembled in every way that mattered, a home. They had married in winter, bound by necessity. But love, Sarah learned, did not require sunshine to grow. It only required two hearts brave enough to risk the cold. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap